I've always believed that one way or another, all products ultimately end up being parametric. And I know that's a little sci-fi to say that, but really what I mean by that is when you really think about it, any insurance product is fundamentally based on parameters. It's just those parameters sometimes are a little fuzzy. They're built on a model that might be independent, then require a claims approach that is also independent. But it's not like the claims adjuster or the person calculating claims is calculating it in a vacuum. They're taking into consideration data inputs and making an assessment based on that. So if you can imagine a world where you have access to everything in real time, like just imagine you had data for everything within a house, everything that's happening, you could potentially compute claims in an instant way. And in that universe, it's technically all parametric.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Instech podcast. Our New York event is right around the corner, and soon we're jetting off to meet everyone on the 4th of June. Our second New York event of the year, 2024 An Insurance Odyssey, will be on just before InsurTech Insights, so do come along and say hi if you're in the area. We are nearly at capacity, and we are prioritizing insurers, brokers, MGAs, and Instech members. This week on the podcast, we have a slightly different episode. Jonathan Gonzalez, co-founder and CEO of Raincoat, sits down with Matthew, covering the evolution and scaling of parametric products, the impact of climate events on the insurance sector, and the technicalities of developing fair and effective insurance solutions. This isn't the first time we have Jonathan on the podcast. This is part of our ongoing podcast series of Raincoat, highlighting important developments in the parametric insurance space. If you are curious to learn more, we have a dedicated parametric newsletter that comes out monthly, which you can subscribe to and be up to date on how the space is evolving. Over to Matthew and Jonathan.
Jonathan, it's great to have you back. And this is a bit of an experiment, but we're going to basically have you in the pilot seat or the co-pilot seat for the Instech podcast. So we're going to have a chat today, and then maybe you might even be able to do one all on your own. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for being part of the experiment.
No, thank you for having me, Matthew. It's always a pleasure.
So just for those that haven't come across Raincoat before, just talk a little bit about what you're doing. So you're essentially providing the technology, the analytics, the data to support embedded insurance with a parametric angle. You yourself, as you discussed in the last couple of podcasts, had a personal experience on this, and it's just been great to watch the way the business has developed from a real challenge that your family faced, and now to business with funding and some pretty strong success and views around parametric. For those who want to just do their homework and follow along with the Raincoat story. So the first podcast was back in March 2022, and then we spoke to you again October last year. What's been happening in the last 12 months in the Raincoat world?
Yeah, as you can imagine, there's been a pretty big acceleration when it comes to interest in parametric products, particularly parametric products that can be scaled. So it's a really exciting space for us because it's not only about how do you build and develop those types of products, but also the infrastructure that is needed to scale them, the types of channels where that works best, and the kinds of collaborations that you need to put in place. But it's a really interesting topic. And in addition to that, you also see everything that's happening with climate. There's been a lot of public outcry when it comes to the insurance sector dealing with climate events, particularly in the US, certain insurance carriers leaving markets entirely. So there's a really large natural disaster insurance gap. And naturally, people are looking at how do you solve that? And one of the first steps is considering parametric products and those types of deployments.
Yeah, two big themes in there. We've all been talking about climate. We've just had an election announced here in the UK. How the different parties are going to position the journey to net zero is a big part of that. It feels like people are waking up and going, this is real. I need to do something about it. My personal life, corporate life, regulation. And I think your scale point, I'd agree. A lot of technologies that people get the reason why they exist, but it takes quite a long time to get adoption. And then there's a sort of tipping point at which they do work. In this case, they pay out, and the technology can enable scale. So it seems like we are seeing more success out there. Some of the companies in your space are really starting to get some quite significant funding as well, and really be a credible alternative. And I guess from your point of view, you're persevering to get here, and now the fun really starts.
Absolutely. And like with most innovations, it requires iteration, right? I think this is akin to kind of what's happening in the AI space. I think people who write off the impacts of AI in the insurance sector are probably doing it prematurely because a lot of this is iterative. You start with something and then you have an inbound of people and innovation, both startups, but also corporate companies that are trying different things, different approaches. And as you calibrate, it's like you're winding down to hit target. And that's how oftentimes these innovative products come to be. They start with a lot of little projects being tried, a lot of little things that are here and there, and then it starts to grow and scale and eventually becomes very formidable.
Yeah, and I was talking to somebody else from a major US insurance carrier today, and he was saying progress for them is that they no longer receive handwritten endorsements on the policies or the renewals they're getting from their brokers and the clients. They're still all in messy spreadsheets and PDFs, but finally, it's actually digital, which is obviously easier to ingest. So I think you're probably seeing the same thing, and we'd be great to talk a little bit about what does that evolution, and it's somewhat incremental until it gets to this tipping point.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting conversations or one of the changes or shifts that I've seen is it's no longer about this versus that. It sometimes, I would say it's a bit of a mistake to see parametrics as its own little creature, right? And then you have indemnity on the other side, when in reality, parametrics should be looked at as a tool, as a potential solution, part of a toolbox. And in that sense, parametric products can be standalone products and they can be good enough for specific sectors, specific risks, specific segments, but they can also be an attribute of another completely different insurance solution. For example, an indemnity based cover that happens to have a fast, immediate payout in a parametric context. So I think when the line starts to blur, is actually a good thing in this context because we focus on the core, which is ultimately you're trying to offer a good risk transfer solution to a client. And whether that risk transfer solution is parametric or indemnity or a combination or something completely different is a little bit irrelevant to the value that the product is promising that client. So we really like to push to the limits of where you can take parametrics, in particularly when it starts to blur the line. And I know it's a little hard sometimes to kind of see that, especially when you see parametrics in their current state. But I do think it's just a matter of time and probably measured in years or decades.
And it's a great rallying cry or vision, if you like, for the industry to move towards. I mean, I guess you could debate, is parametric the whole offering? Is a trigger only? Is not indemnity? Or to your point, the way you're describing it to me reminds me of smart contracts that we are part of the conversation around the possible use of blockchain. The problem with blockchain, there's far too much hype about it and then it didn't deliver. But smart contracts, it's a great concept, although like parametric, you need to be really rigorous on how those smart contracts actually trigger a payout. But I mean, essentially, that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
It's funny that you mention it. The thing that got me into the parametric side was smart contracts, actually. Before I knew that parametric insurance was even a name or a category, it was really the idea of executing a contract based on a series of parameters. And then when we started looking into that, what we kind of realized was exactly what you just mentioned, that outside of the transfer itself, like being able to move money from one side to another, which is the thing that a smart contract would sort of guarantee in an independent way, you also have to make sure that the moment when you trigger that money and the amount is super accurate. And that's where you get into the technicalities of the quality of the product.
And I'm also just thinking that, Jonathan, as you're talking there, that your background is programming, isn't it?
Yeah.
Earlier, last year, I started just looking to see how far I could get in writing Python code. My original attempts at coding were like 35 years ago with Fortran when I was doing an engineering degree, and we're not really very good then. But the thing that I really learned from that or was reminded about is when you write code, you've got to be really precise. There's no room for sort of fuzziness, as there is, frankly, in a lot of insurance contracts. And so I'm just thinking, as you're talking about your kind of entry into this with smart contract, it makes complete sense because that would be the way you would think a coder would be like, this has to be really precise, otherwise the code's not going to run.
Absolutely. For a company that's very active in insurance, you would expect to see a lot more insurance people. But in reality, it's mostly just engineers and scientists that fundamentally understand some of these nuances. If you do a Google search on parametric products, a common example that is brought up in a lot of websites is one based on rain, where they say, well, if a certain amount of rain happens, we pay, and if a certain amount of rain doesn't happen, we don't pay. Conceptually, that is very straightforward. But when you actually go into the nuances of that, you get into a very deeply technical space. For example, which data set are you using to measure precipitation? There's actually a lot of them. There's different sensors, different types of satellites. If you actually grab a specific point on the planet today and you try to estimate precipitation on any of them, you're going to have very different values. So, when does one work well? When does one not work well? Why? How sustainable and scalable are they? How reliable are they? What are the error management on the equation of that data set? The reality is that there's a lot of little aspects here that are very deeply technical. And then that's just on the data set side, let alone when you're actually building the product and calibrating it to an actual loss event, right? Because you actually want the product to pay correlated to losses or correlated to a real event that creates a loss because it's insurance ultimately. So that's really where all that engineering and scientific complexity comes in. And it's the area that really we love being inside. And that's what we're thinking about every single day and what keeps us up at night.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about engineers. I had a great quote years ago that an engineer, and this is like talking about what we call in the UK software developer, would rather spend time with an engineer they dislike than with another person that wasn't an engineer they like more. There's such a sort of depth of mutual understanding at the kind of intellectual level. It does come back to that sort of search for the truth. You can't hide from the truth when you're writing code.
Absolutely. And there's a core question here, not to get philosophical, but what is truth? This is actually a real serious issue within the parametric space. What is truth on both sides of the equation? What is truth when it comes to a loss event? What is an actual loss? How much was it? How much do you trust that that is true? And then the second is, if I can then build a model that can accurately correlate to that, I need to also know what is true within the concept of that model. So it is funny because you ultimately do end up with a company of a lot of truth seekers. And that is ultimately what we try to do. You would imagine the amount of heated debates that you could get into around some of these topics that from the outside might seem silly, but for people that are deeply passionate about these problems, it's a very interesting set of topic. And as you mentioned, it's a joint effort towards this pursuit of truth more than anything else.
Yeah. And of course, the customer. I mean, ultimately, the most important thing, other than a company making profit who's issuing this, is that the customer feels there's a fairness for the payout they got for what they spent on their insurance. That whole point of truth has got another layer on top of it, which is, what's the tolerance for uncertainty, and how do you allow for the fact that somebody has committed money to protecting themselves and the instrument they used or the company they spent the money with didn't provide that. I mean, this is back to the smart contract discussion. Is it entirely a mechanical payout, or do you have to allow for some edge cases where you say, well, actually, okay, the instrument performed correctly, but actually I value my client relationship more, so I'm going to have some kind of top up or way of complementing them. Do you see much of that, or is it tend to be a bit pure on that?
No, actually, what you bring up is super important. It's another one that we talk a lot about internally, which is fair, right? Fair is actually what matters, or what is fair is what the customer thinks is fair. And oftentimes that is very perception driven. So I'll give you an example in the context of Puerto Rico. So one of our very first products was a hurricane product that we launched in Puerto Rico. And there were a lot of ways that we could have designed that product. And some of those were very scientifically precise when it came to like the model and the way to measure a specific, let's say, wind speed over a location. And what we found in a lot of those cases was sometimes what actually the client preferred was the model that they felt was fair, not necessarily the one that was more accurate. And the context, right, that these customers are considering is the context of, well, maybe my house is fine. My whole infrastructure around me is not. So my electricity grid is down. I don't have water. I've lost all the things in my fridge. I'm not going to be able to work for at least 2 months. When you're really developing out this model, you're trying to find the model that is fairest to that reality, not necessarily just the physics based ones. And I think that's where it's a bit of a combination of an art and science, and something that we take very seriously on our end when developing these products, because it really is that intersection of reality and truth, and then the real lived experience of the individuals that you're working with. And as you can imagine from my background and what got me into this space, it's also very true to kind of my own experience, which was, look, my insurance policy, or the insurance policy of my mother, right? It didn't pay out. I understand it didn't pay out. I understand why it didn't pay out. I also understand how it was modeled and why it was structured that way. Would my mother still consider that fair? No, right? And that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and I've had a much smaller version of that. But when you are on the receiving end of what you think is a an unfair refusal to pay, it just undermines the whole confidence in the company you're paying money with. So started talking about an example there, but what have you seen as working that you've been directly involved with, the types of cover or the companies or individuals getting cover?
Well, I would say whenever the product is embedded deeply within the channel, as close as possible to the risk that's being analyzed, it tends to perform better. But then developing those types of products requires a whole new different set of thinking, right? From the integrations that you need to do at the channel level to the way that product is structured and the type of support that you need to provide it. And also the regulatory aspects as well. Each country has their own kind of regulatory framework around these products. And sometimes you need to be very creative on how do you incorporate that local regulation with the product. So in our case, most of our products are fully admitted in the countries and locations where we operate in because a lot of them interact with real like consumers, normal people. So what we've really seen is the more you can integrate with that channel of distribution, the more you can integrate also with the payment rails. So we've had to build out a lot of that. The better the experience is actually going to be and the more that you can actually deliver the promise of the product ultimately. So, for example, when Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico in 2022, we were able to execute notifications and payments within 24 hours. That was a magical experience, but you don't actually get that unless you have everything else that's required to actually deliver that. Like all the nuances and all the details that have to be lined up for that specific experience to execute in that way.
Just want to make sure that we pick up on your comment about admitted, because for those that don't speak insurance or are kind of new to the space, that basically refers to where, and I guess the US is probably the best example here, where the US state regulator has to approve the rates that are being filed by the insurer, and that becomes part of the policy wording. So your point is that because you're dealing with consumers and retail, not only do you have to stand up to the rigor and I guess the fairness of is the experience a good experience for the consumer, you also have an independent organization assessing that those rates are correct. It's not a layer of complexity for you to overcome, which therefore congratulations for doing it. And I want to come back to that example you just gave. So when you build this product and the forecast of hurricanes coming in, it's crikey, I imagine you're all on standby, and these hurricanes always happen over the weekend or public holidays and at night. You're watching what happens because presumably it's like our smart contract example. You want to make sure this thing performs properly and it doesn't go rogue and start making payouts or not making payouts. And do you allow for some kind of human intervention in there if things aren't working quite as the model suggested, or once you've committed to parametric, you got to stand back and let it do its work?
That's a great question. So it's a combination of good engineering and human overview. Now, in the case of hurricanes, it's a little easier because oftentimes you can see them coming. I would say much more complicated cases are maybe something like what we see in Colombia, where we have some deployments that activate almost every day. And at that point, you have a certain cadence, certain infrastructure that you have to have up and running to even be able to handle that. Now, I would say that a lot of it is automated and a lot of it has human review as well, just for the sake of just the clarity and making sure, that everything is correct. How you architect that out, both from a software perspective and a operational perspective, is a lot of what we've iterated and really tried to land because it can get quite complicated, as you can imagine. And the more deployments that you manage across a larger geography, the more likely that it is that you have an event happening somewhere every time, right? So that's really where you have to build the team in place and kind of be ready to manage that. At this point, we've had quite a bit of experience just activating claims, doing payouts across multiple jurisdictions. So we feel pretty comfortable with it. But there's always like this little feeling of magic, kind of butterflies right before you're going to execute the whole process because you want to make sure that everything runs well, right? And then you want to do a post-mortem on it to understand what can be improved. And it's a whole cycle.
And so what's happening in Colombia where they're having payouts every day? Is that some kind of attritional rain loss?
Yeah, so it's a series of products. It's just when you have a really large geography, like a full country, there's always some sort of catastrophe happening somewhere, right? If you just look at the United States, there's probably some sort of natural disaster, even at a local scale, happening at all times. So they're maybe not the types of events that would get picked up on national news. But from a local perspective, there was maybe a very large drought or a very large flood or just an event, right, at a local level that is impacting people. And then the cover is activated.
Yeah. And actually, to talk about flood, it just reminds me sort of a couple of conversations I had recently with Mark Firmer at Geosmart, which is a UK flood consulting firm. And one of the areas they focus on is groundwater. Another whole level of complexity to your point before about what is rainfall, because I mean, the concept is pretty simple. If it rains a lot, the water goes into the ground, it sits there, and it moves through the ground, but it can take 2 to 4 weeks to get into the river system. So if you get rain after you've had a heavy series of rain, you're much more likely to get flooding. So just another level of sort of the tricky, I guess, how difficult it is to make sure these things correlate with the actual loss.
And actually you raise a great point. Oftentimes people think about perils like as a kind of like as a catch-all bucket. Let's say hurricanes, right? A singular event like a hurricane creates all sorts of macro events, whether we're talking about rain, flooding, wind speeds, just all sorts of different impacts. And based on just knowing the peril isn't enough because then you have to understand the context that the peril is supposed to actually be impacting, right? So, what I mean by this is I would structure a product very differently if I'm thinking about it from the perspective of property versus if I'm thinking about it from the perspective of excess expenses and like loss of income versus if I'm thinking about it from a perspective of infrastructure like water, grid, electricity. So all of those using the same exact kind of event, we're talking about a hurricane, could use different data sets, could use different models, could use different degrees of resolution or just a different interpretation, right, of the same event. You see it a lot with rain related things because, as you mentioned, there's all sorts of different ways that you could model it or structure it or measure it, but you see it across all the perils. So, Matthew, I've been a loyal podcast listener since you guys started. So, I've heard a lot of the parametric podcasts that you've run, a lot of the interviews, and I'm curious from your perspective, what have you seen in the space? Some of the areas that you've seen change in recent years, what excites you now?
There's two parts to it. One of the barriers to deployment of parametric has been how well brokers out in the field understand it, whether that's retail, small business, all the way up to commercial. And so one of the things that interesting someone spoke about the other day was if you think about a broking organization, that is a bunch of people. And often the people within that organization who are the ones to target if you're selling a new insurance product are the people out in the field who've got relationships with clients who are probably a bit more tech savvy. And I'm starting to hear more of those kind of people being more interested in what's happening. So I think that's one positive thing. But on the other side of it, I'm also starting to hear about organizations that are looking for ways to go outside of the traditional broker relationship and are getting a little bit frustrated, frankly, that the brokers they're dealing with don't understand this or aren't providing more flexible solutions. Starting to see that in the corporate space. Yeah, they're just going direct to some of the providers out there. So I don't know if that is consistent with what you're seeing, or maybe you've seen some of that directly, but there's certainly movement. I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad, but there's certainly, I'd say, there's a shift in the role of the brokers that we're going to see more of this year ahead.
Absolutely. And I would say one of the challenges that you currently see in the parametric space that definitely impacts the brokers and the clients is that comparing parametric products is actually really difficult, which is actually something that I haven't quite figured out yet. Kind of pose as a question to anyone who's listening because this is something that regulators are thinking about. This is something that just it's like a macro problem where for a traditional product, you oftentimes have very specific things that you can look at, whether that is the deductible, the limits, the exclusions, and then for the most part, you can do some sort of comparison, or at least there's like a shared understanding or vocabulary that you can use. In the parametric context, that is actually really hard to do because you can have two products that are both hurricane related products on very different data sets, on very different models, with very different structures and very different limits. And it's actually quite hard, right, for a client to understand the difference between these different options, or even for the broker, right, to be able to understand those differences and then provide the best solution for their client. So how as an industry do we solve some of these problems, I think is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about that other big problem. And there's an article in the Financial Times about this. Solar farms are getting bigger and bigger. Wind turbines are getting higher and higher. There's more and more dependency upon those. And the insurance industry has not got an ability to cover those. And partly it's because the risk or the perception of the risk is really high. Traditionally now, the catastrophe bond market does tap into money outside of insurance, but that's moved more towards an indemnity market. But are you seeing some opportunities out there to solve this protection gap problem when it gets to very large renewables projects through some other ways if the insurers haven't got the appetite for it?
Well, I think there's an interesting subcategory in there, which is when you have really clear products like parametric products that are packaged into a portfolio or very large, it does become easier for capital markets to get involved because the expertise required to analyze those types of products ultimately are statistical and data related and not even insurance related in some cases, right? Like you could just run a model, see the implications of it. So I do think that as these types of products become much more common, much more frequent, does open up access to outside capital that would normally be on the sidelines because they might lack insurance expertise, but they still have good mathematical expertise, right? And that's sufficient enough for them to be able to price this risk and actually play in that playground. So to me, it's all connected, right? Where you both have the supply side issue, you have the demand side issue, and both of them are growing to a certain extent. So I'm very optimistic, honestly, on the future when it comes to getting capacity for these types of solutions. And I expect it to continue to just evolve and grow.
Well, watch out because you might have some quite large global organizations knocking on your door saying, "Can Raincoat provide some cover for my offshore turbine farm?" I mean, the example I keep coming back to because it's so material. There's the Danish investment fund that's got over €1 billion of assets coming online for offshore energy, and they can't get insurance for it, or they can't get insurance for a lot of it. So it's a big problem because there's only so much self-insurance these companies are willing to do. So anybody listening, Raincoat might be your solution. I'm not quite sure whether you've got capacity, Jonathan, for $100 billion worth of. I mean, I'm sure they're diversified around the world. They're not all going to have a loss in one go.
For sure, for sure. I mean, that's the challenge always of a startup, right? You can be directionally correct, but still be off on timing. And that's always the innovator's dilemma to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting what Sid and Arbol are doing. Kind of Sid's background as a trader, tapping into sort of some outside of the traditional insurance markets, but also now in the insurance space. So I'm sort of saying that on the assumption that the pie, the slice of the pie is big enough for those who are offering parametric to collaborate as opposed to need to compete.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of surface area when it comes to these products. I actually think that the category itself is a little bit too broad, right? When we say parametrics, there's a lot of components that go into that, from the data to the science to the infrastructure to the capacity to the actual products themselves, distribution, brokering. So in a sense, there's a ton of surface area that has to get covered. And I think different players will hyper specialize in a lot of those areas, and at some point, I would expect some sort of vertical integration of the market or across different market leaders. But for now, it's pure blue ocean.
What's interesting is, organizations like yours have come along from either outside of the industry or certainly outside of the modeling industry to offer these solutions. But, the big modeling firms, Moody's now, S&P, Verisk, Swiss Re, I could be slightly careful what I say because some of the Swiss Re is there on the placement side. I don't think I'm seeing the scale of sort of support for parametric as a product that I'm seeing, to your point, from the sort of innovators and people starting from scratch. Is that your impression, or it's quite possible I'm missing something, and please do tell me if I'm missing.
Well, I would say a lot of those entities do support. They just support in different ways, right? Whether that is capacity behind some of the deployments that we support or in some of the models that they provide. I think there's always just some degree of specialization in the space. And from a reinsurer perspective, for example, then you expect them to just reinsure the deployment and then support that deployment and make sure it's a success. And in that sense, they're going to be a little bit more quiet about it because that's just what the traditional model has always been, right? I would definitely say that the insurance industry has been surprisingly open minded and has been very kind to us. So we're very fortunate to have the partners that we have. I have immense amount of respect for everyone who works in the industry. You kind of sometimes hear these podcasts or hear the articles, and the insurance industry is quite good at whipping itself and saying like, "Oh, we're so slow, we're so bad." But my experience has actually been quite the opposite. They tend to be very open, and of course, there's going to be some aspect of conservatism because you have a big brand and a big industry that you have to defend. But given all of that, it's been very supportive.
Certainly from the capacity providers, there's some large companies that are definitely supporting the delivery of the capacity for sure. So before we wrap up, what else should we be talking about, and what else do you want to comment on?
I think what's happening outside of weather and in all the other spaces that we see that parametric products can apply, I think are super exciting. Some of these might be still related to like NatCat events, like whether that's using sensors, for example, in the case of earthquakes, or they might be related to completely different risks like cyber risk, incomeless, business interruption. Like I think those are really interesting categories where you're looking at a completely different set of data sets, and how you can combine those into proper product and experience is really interesting. And again, as the category continues to evolve, and we find completely new ways to cover some of these risks, I think parametrics will increasingly be a big protagonist of those new approaches and solutions.
Good. Well, I feel that's a good teaser for our next episode. Jonathan, many thanks for the discussion. You're an excellent co-pilot, and I'm looking forward to handing over the controls to you for a future podcast we're going to do together on the broad topic for this. And just for anybody listening, go to the website and find this podcast or any podcast. There is a opportunity to ask a question and actually have that and join the podcast, because if you record it on the link, you can actually ask a question for Jonathan and I to answer. So here's a chance to be on the InStep podcast. But Jonathan, thank you very much. And hope to see you face to face again soon. At some point, I'm sure our paths will cross in the same location.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Matthew. It's always a pleasure, and really looking forward to continuing to talk about this.
It may feel like every day something new happens in Parametric. Keep watching this space to hear Raincoat come back in an exciting episode with some even more exciting topics. That's all from us this week. See you next Sunday.